section 1. We're looking at one of the foundational ideas of physics. We're talking about a man by the name of Galileo, who comes up with this concept called inertia. And how he comes up with this idea of inertia, let me go grab the equipment real quick, is he uses nothing more than a ramp and a ball. And it's what he notices with a ramp and a ball. So you have a ramp on two sides. You have it this side and this side. When he releases the ball on one side, what he finds out is that the ball will go, it's pretty hard to do with one-handed, all the way back up to the original height on the other side. So it'll start up high here, and it'll end up with the same height here. Well, he then proceeds to say, well, what happens if I lower the ramp, if I change the angle on it? He finds out he climbs the same height. And if you keep changing that angle of this ramp, okay, so if you change that angle and you lengthen out the ramp so it can return back to its original height, the ball climbs back to that height over and over again. So regardless of how far out that ramp goes, regardless of how shallow the incline is, the ball always returns to that original height. Well, Galileo calls that property inertia. In layman, well, not in layman's terms, in physics terms, what inertia means is that every object has a property that once it's in motion, it will want to stay in motion. Or a property that states that once that it's at rest, once it's stopped, it will stay at rest. Okay? So it sounds a lot like, if most of you know, Newton's first law. It turns out Galileo comes up with 3 laws of motion. And those 3 laws of motion turn into Newton's first law of motion. Galileo's first law, I think it's his first law, that once an object is in motion, it will continue to stay in motion. Once an object is in rest, it will continue to stay at rest. And then in order to change the motion of that object, a force needs to be acted on that object. Okay, so those are Galileo's 3 laws of inertia. But that's all you're doing. You're examining whether this measure of the incline here has any effect on how high that ball travels. And it shouldn't. Galileo says, it shouldn't affect. But one thing Galileo did in his experiment is that he took wax and he coated his track with wax so that there was very little friction going on. We're not that sophisticated in this class, so you will see the ball not quite travel up to the original height. You know, obviously if you let this ball rolling back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, it's eventually going to come to the stop at the very bottom of it. And that's because of friction. That's because there is a force acting on that object, and it's going to bring it to a stop. Okay? So that's the principle of inertia, that once that object is in motion, it will continue to stay in motion. And Galileo shows that with this track thing. And actually the very end of Galileo's track idea, this is to drop this in so that it's flat. And he argued that because that end of that track never reaches back to the original height, that object will continue to move forever. Law of motion. Okay, cool. So that's chapter 2, section 1. Motion. Inertia, I do believe is the name of it. Cool?